Ah! That's on YouTube. Is it? Great. Thousands of people. Like my last YouTube video, I think I had 30 people watch it. People were like, yeah, next.
All right, we're going to start. Okay, so this is Brennan Crow. He's doing a talk on threat modeling.
Well, all right. All right, so my day job, a little bit about me. My day job, I'm a senior security architect at a large bank. For my spare time and for the ability of not having to go through approvals for my primary employer, I'm also an adjunct professor at Collin College in their cybersecurity program. All right, so today, a lot of you are probably new on threat modeling, I hope. Or have you heard of it? You've heard of it, good. How many of you have actually implemented it? Okay, I know somebody's giving a talk on it later. So, the thing is though with threat modeling, most of you think about doing it subconsciously, all right? Most of you just have no idea about, what it is. But they've created this formalized process, I would say, to give you a structured approach to identify and prioritize threats. So, for my ladies in the audience, this is something my wife made me aware of. When you have your purse and you go shopping, do you always have it like wrapped around somewhere or concealed or have your thing there? Or are always aware of your surroundings when you walk out into a parking lot? Okay? Like whenever I've been in some situations that were hairy before, and like whenever I walk into a room, I always look for my exits, all right? So these are some things I look to see, what am I gonna do if there is a threat? Where are the vulnerabilities gonna be at? What's my egress route if I need one? So threat modeling, it's basically the structured approach to identify and prioritize these security threats out there. So, how many of you what can you identify as a threat out there? We have all read about it in our training stuff. It's something that can do harm, pretty much, right? So, mosquito could be a threat. All right? How many millions of people end up dead because of mosquitoes throughout the world? Millions. Now you know more about a threat, higher priority or lower priority, okay? These are kind of things you always think about. Now, one of the things you can do is anything, let me state this, anything can be threat modeled, okay? Anything you look at in the world, from your perspective, can be threat modeled, okay? And what you have to do is you have to assess your threats, all right? You're at an ATM machine, you see a bunch of bearded guys with a bunch of tattoos just hanging around, a little bit outside of that. How would you assess that threat? Could it be a threat? Maybe. All right. What's my usual mitigation for if I have to go to an ATM at night? I do open carry. I'll take out my concealed carry, put it on my belt, and go. Make sure they are aware that I have a mitigation for any threat, right? It sounds like a good plan. I'm not advocating any kind of thing, but in essence, in a cybersecurity world, you don't have a firewall. You're connected straight out to the internet. It's a pretty easy target, low-hanging fruit, right? So these are kind of things you want to do. I don't run antivirus. No. Low-hanging fruit. So what you're going to look at is identifying those vulnerabilities and ways to mitigate those threats. I should say antivirus anymore. It shows my age. Sorry, I'm Gen X. All right. So we see these things out there. So now it's anti-malware and other devices like that. So I encourage you to go out there, and if you want to read more about threat modeling, you have the threatmodelingmanifesto.org, which is a short thing that identifies a lot of different ways to do it, a lot of which I'm going to cover here today. So the first thing you have to do is, when you're threat modeling, is identify your assets. And this is one thing most people, whether you're in IT or anywhere else, you have to identify, what do I have? All right? Consider your own house, okay, or where you reside. All your worldly possessions out there, all right? Something, a threat could happen to that. Lightning strike, fire, something like that. Oh yeah, I got insurance. That's a mitigation. But is everything covered under that insurance? Is it? I heard a right there. Yeah, these are things that we have to look at. So you have to identify all your assets, keep an inventory. How many of you work at an IT shop where you don't know what you have in there or been involved in one? Yeah, I've worked at one, like, I got asked to go fix a firewall one time, and nobody knew anything about it, and like, oh yeah, that thing, it said it was scheduled for retirement back in 2008. I go, is it still running? Oh yeah, people are still using it. I'm like, but we just took it off the books. Huh? So we didn't know what we had. This thing had not been patched since 2008. This is back in 2014. 7 years. I'm like, okay, let me see if I can find documentation for this thing. So you have to understand your systems, your networks out there. What applications are you running? How many of you know what all applications are running in your own network? How many of you know all applications are running on your own personal laptops? All right, or your own personal devices, or on your phones? I mean, how many of you have any idea of what you have? All right, and then you have to identify where your data is at. Because that's what everyone wants to protect, is the data, correct? Not much of the equipment, but your intellectual property. That's your most valuable asset to most everybody, right? Everybody's IP. So we have that, and all your information out there. It's also important to identify your coworkers, all the personnel that work in your company, because people are an asset to your company, all right? They're there to be, you also have to provide that protection, that security protection. It's good to know where they're at, you know, like have a good directory, phone number, address, kind of information in case something happens or they need to be contacted. We had that big storm came through Dallas. I got an email from our SOAC, and it says, hey, we hope you're safe. If you need anything, click here, and they'll bring up the form. So they knew where I reside and how something close to my area got hit by a tornado. Luckily, didn't get any damage. I had some people's shingles laying in my yard, but that was about it. So we had that. And then you also need to know where your infrastructure is. Many of you work in offices. How many of you know actually where your data centers are located? All right, so you know where your data centers are located. How many of you know how to get there and their address and their contact information? I see one hand. Very good, sir. Do you work in the data center? Okay. All right, so a lot of people don't have that handy. And it's like, oh, where's that data center at? Oh, it's in Louisville. Or it's in Itasca or Ithaca or someplace like that. So we get all that kind of stuff. So there, so we have what we have to understand and click. After that, we have to go in there and we have to identify our asset. We're identifying our assets now. What are their importance? Okay? How many of you have taken the CISSP? All right. What's the first thing they tell you to protect? What's the most important thing? Life, human life. Okay? So, people, assets, protecting that, top priority. Then what comes next? After that, that's when it gets convoluted. All right? That was the easy question. So what comes next after that? What is the most important? Securing your data centers, securing, PII data, your personal identifiable information data, your financial data, all these different things, your marketing, your research and development data. All these things, based on their data classifications, need to be identified and determine what they could think. Then next, your equipment, your facilities, and all those can have different prioritization rates based on the perspective of who utilizes it the most. Okay? One thing I did forget to say is threat modeling is not a single person's activity. It's a group activity. Okay? This is where you take a group of people and everyone contributes. And they all pitch their perspectives. So whenever you see somebody go, no, you have to do a threat model, and they assign it to one person, that is doomed for, for mediocrity. Okay? Unless you have the one person, one man shop who's a whiz, but it's good to have buy-in from a number of people, a number of perspectives on a number of different things. It's really important to do that. So after that, you got to understand the potential threats. So where can somebody, what is a threat that attacks us? Okay? So, this is where you guys come into play. Name a threat. APTs, okay? So what's a good threat is an APT threat, advanced persistent threat. All right, what else? What particular APTs could be out there? Chinese, Russian hacking, okay? What else? Huh? Social engineering, phishing links.
Teenagers with the computers.
Incompetent users. Okay. Your front end users who don't, the lady who's been here for like 38 years, and she has, everything, and she goes in and types in and out of stuff, the newbie that comes in who wants to show off. Look how sharp I am. That's kind of the intern. All right. What else? Come on, think outside the box here. Lightning strike, natural disasters. Okay? I happened to work during 9/11 when I was at Microsoft. I'll give you a quick story on that. The credit union for the city of New York was located in one of those buildings that was leaning next to the World Trade Center that eventually did collapse. One guy on September 12th went up, they wouldn't let anybody in there, but he got in there. He walked up 7 flights of steps with a couple of bags, I think they were pillowcase bags, and took all the hard drives out of all the systems, all right, because that's where they had all their stuff. Without that, none of those firefighters, nurses, police, city workers in the city of New York, that's where all their pay came from. And that's where they put all their money, in that credit union. So it affected a large amount of people. And he had to go in there, and he was just opening up those RAID 5 boxes, pulling out those hard drives and dropping them in. They set up a thing across the river in Jersey City for them to rebuild it. We spent 14 hours playing roulette, trying to figure out which one because he forgot to label. All right? But that was a threat that they were vulnerable to. Because of that, a lot of people have business continuity plans, off-site locations, and things like that to where it was. They have them pre-labeled before they go in there. Because this is back in the Wild West days, y'all. Like I said, I'm Gen X, I'm old school. All right. So you got to understand all these different types of threats that can be there. So you're seeing all these different threats that can come in. Then you got to prioritize these threats, okay? Which one is most likely to be executed on me? Which one is the most likelihood to happen? You got these threats. Which one would be most devastating out there? So we look at that. And then at that point, you got to figure out, how do I create countermeasures and mitigations for this? So you develop them. So network security, I implement, firewalls, DLP, inline antivirus, other things like that. for a number of networking threats. For system threats, implement business continuity plans, redundancy, off-site storage, cloud storage, move to the cloud. There's a lot of different type of mitigations you can have for on-site stuff, all right? So then you have to look at what is the attack vector, okay? So the attack vector is how are they going to attack me? Is it a network attack? Is it a physical attack? Where am I vulnerable at? Okay. So, there's one story I remember reading when I was at Microsoft where they were pointing a microphone at the systems, and they're able to copy clacking of keyboards, and they were able to interpret which keys were being pressed, from a remote location. There's a parabolic. They've also had it where it can have the frequency data off a computer without actually being on there to remotely hack it. There's different ways how they can do it. So, do you implement, Faraday cage on your Windows? Something like that?
Van Eck freaking's old as time.
Huh?
Van Eck freaking's old as time. I mean, like one guy now, you can take one of those radio things from Great Scott Gadgets that they use for radio hacking.
Yeah.
You can just sit a laptop next to the computer and based on if he, certain software, you can listen to the chips.
Yeah. What happens? Good point. What happens if you've got a guy who comes in and drops a Pony Express or a Metasploit device, like a Telesploit? Yeah, even their air gap kind of stuff can do that.
They can get to talk. They can get to talk over ultrasound. They can get to talk. There's a number of exploits to get the data off. Wi-Fi basically radios can read them.
Right. War dialing. Like you can go out there. How many of you got in that Pringles can and wrapped it with wire and driven around? How many of you use Google to find out what everyone in your neighborhood SSID is? These are things out there you can do. So these are different attack vectors. So you have to understand the different mechanisms where somebody could come at you. All right? All right? And these can be, and a lot of common ones are phishing, malware, network-based attacks. And then you have to evaluate, your attack surface. This is like a cumulative look at all the vulnerabilities within your system out there. All right? And you got to identify, the entry points. So these could be your open ports, something you're publishing, something out there like that. And then what are your weak spots, Do I have any role on my firewall? These are the kind of things you have to evaluate, look at for those things. Do you have an open SSID? Do you allow BYOD in your environment? Are you allowing your users to connect in there? Okay? Bring your own device, bring your own laptop. What happens if those laptops are infected? Or those phones are? Or they're proxying off of it? Or hey, you got a disgruntled employee who decides to copy everything onto his personal device, quit and walk out the door. All right? After you get all that information, you kind of brainstorm together to determine what those are. You set it up like an attack tree, which is kind of a graphical representation of the attacker paths. A lot of the modeling software out there does this for you, but I've seen threat modeling done on napkins. So over in Chicago, I think her name is Kat, I can't remember her last name. She always presents at BSides San Antonio, but she leads up a lot of threat modeling at Google, and she goes and they work on it they go to a bar, do their threat modeling there. They do it on napkins and put it up on like boards and stuff like that when they get back to the office. And they prioritize it, and then they work on their software that way. But the idea is to get them to relax in a relaxed environment and have that free flow of ideas. We don't want to talk about fleas. Well, I have dogs. All right. So then you can create your models and prioritize your mitigations, okay? And then you have your attack life cycle, which talks about, your reconnaissance. Okay, that's how they're going to look at you. They're going to do your exploitation, and then your post-exploitation, and what you're going to do for that. And you can develop mitigations for all three of those stages, okay? Now, we're going to talk about threat modeling tools now. We're going to get some nitty-gritty. Great knowledge, great concepts. What do I do to apply this? Well, there's a number of ways to do this. There's three really main ways how I see how threat modeling can be applied to any of your situations, okay? The first one is from a blue team perspective, the defender perspective, all right? And the most common one you used is called STRIDE, and that's spoofing, tampering, repudiation, information disclosure, and then denial of service and elevation of privilege. All right, I have to throw desist in there, even though hardly anybody uses it, because my old boss, Gunnar Peterson, developed this, and hopefully he watches it and gives me kudos, but he was a great influence on me. So that one is dispute, elevation of privilege, spoofing, information disclosure, denial of service, tampering, spoofing, there's a typo in here, and repudiation. So tampering in there shouldn't have been in there twice, sorry. I gotta go fix that. And then, how many of you have heard of MITRE? Okay, MITRE's a great resource. And a lot of this stuff is out there. So we have the MITRE threat model to defend. And it's D3FEND, okay? And so that's not a typo. But they break it down into harden, detect, isolate, deceive, evict, and restore. So these are different things you can do from a defender's perspective. But how many of you guys are on red team or purple team? Anybody? All right. So if you want to go and attack somebody, you got to kind of think about threat modeling there too if you want to attack them. Huh? You got to look at it from an attacker's perspective, all right? And for that, you have two different things out there that can outline that framework, and that's MITRE CAPEC and MITRE ATTACK. And that goes through all different types of vulnerabilities that you can move to exploit out there and what you can do, and they break it down there. And finally, how many of you are business leaders in here? All right? Well, this one method, or how many of you are consultants? All right, so we have consultants out here and business leaders. What they like to do is a risk-based method, okay? And this is called POSTA. And that's the process for attack simulation and threat analysis. All right, so POSTA is out there, and it's kind of like a holistic movement. And we're going to break down these in a second here. So the STRIDE methodology, as I said, is, identify the categories and threats. Spoofing. How many of y'all know what spoofing is? I'm pretending to be somebody else. So you got that man in the middle attack kind of thing right there, all that. Tampering is when you modify the data and you can mess with all this kind of stuff. It is where, you mess with their stuff like that. Repudiation, that's where you have to, you can't deny who did it. So this is like, I can't erase the log files. I can't deny it was me making that change. All that kind of fun stuff. Information disclosure, this is the big baddie. This is when the stuff gets out. This is the breach notification where information gets exposed. This is where, those hackers take that stuff and they put it on the dark web, whatever. Denial of service, these are your DDoS attacks, your denial of service attacks where it could be out there. And then you have the elevation of privilege. And this is like where somebody can go in there, grab that thing, and become root. And what happens when you become root? Game over. So you don't want to allow that elevation of privilege for them to come in as, they break out the authorization. And although they may be authenticated, they just elevate it what they can do at that level. Okay? Now, desist is similar. Nobody ever really uses this very much, but covers some of the same topics. But the thing is to dispute is one of the key things out there, which it means you kind of try and cause that interruption in their servers. So it's similar to kind of how you can break it up and cause that It's the hardest one to explain, too. So he laughs. He's like, yeah, it is. But it's where you go in there, and it just kind of is something where it's like, I can impersonate a website, like in phishing or something like that. All right. Of course, we talked about elevation privilege, information disclosure. Service denial is basically denial of service, and tampering there, too. Now, the MITRE Defend model, they have a number of topics. So have you ever gone to MITRE Defend? I encourage you to go to that. And they break it down into hardening your system, how to harden your systems or your mobile devices, how to establish that detection out there, of what can be detected. So how many, you said you do some pen testing, you do some fingerprinting, and you do some open source intelligence on these things. So these are things that, what you would like to look for to minimize that out there. It talks about isolating at the time where you would just, if you did get a breach, how are you going to isolate them? How are you going to get that quarantined out there? You talk about the deceive, and like this is kind of like where you could throw out a honeypot or something like that, or honey netting out there, or create something where they are not attacking the main target. You get them off to something else, and then you restore your environment with higher levels of mitigations and protections, patching, stuff like that. Okay? So next, on the attacker method, you have the MITRE CAPEC, and that's pronounced CAPEC. If you ever want to go into this, they have a free training for MITRE CAPEC on MITRE's website. It's through Cybrary, and they'll teach you on that. But you go to capec.mitre.org. It's publicly available common attacks and patterning. I think it's Cybrary or something like that that offers it. You just have to register, and you get the free course. But it helps you understand how adversaries exploit those weaknesses. And then if you're really heavy duty and you're like into full red teaming, go to MITRE Attack. I mean, they break it down to a lot of different cool stuff there. It's knowledge base with tactics and techniques based on real world observations, okay? So yeah, this is like basically Metasploit and all that broken out on a web page telling you how to do it. It's a great resource for those wanting to learn red teaming. Now comes my favorite one. This is what all of them should be. This is the Delphi technique, okay? How many of you have heard of Delphi technique? It's where somebody brought up to me that they did table talks. How is this different from table talking? It's really not. And this is where the whole group takes place. And it's a group-based idea thing, where everybody can throw out ideas and concepts and all of that. So group-based brainstorming. So everybody sits at a table like that group from Google who do that software where they go out there, have a few beers. A lot of times people bring in, book a conference room, fly in together, or have a conference, some like, here's credit for Uber Eats, create a situation where it's open, welcoming, and ideas can be shared. And during this time, you come up with threats and all the mitigations and stuff, and you prioritize that. And this is where you would try and incorporate as many different levels from your organization as possible, from your application teams. And finally, we get into PASTA, okay? So for that, you have the process for attack simulation and threat analysis. This is basically risk-based threat modeling, okay? This is where you're gonna get stakeholders from upper management down to your application engineers out there, all right? And they're gonna tell you, what is their important. A lot of times this breaks down into the cost-based analysis of it. So you have your risk-based analysis, you have all those nice formulas for risk for those who have taken those risk classes out there. So, the cost of the asset times likelihood of occurrence, all those kind of different formulas. You've heard of those. Some of you are nodding, some are yawning, but that's basically how that goes. So it is that, and it's a framework designed to elevate to management, to understand the threat modeling, where they can understand how, like the cost of replacement, or the cost of what happens reputationally if we have a breach, okay? It helps build that understanding of that. Because the previous techniques really kind of only focus on the technical thing. This is where it focuses on a lot of things of what ifs. You know, what is this going to cost us in the long run? The way I look at it. So you do the vulnerability checks, the weakness analysis, your attack modeling, and you go through all that, and it's expressed through whatever you want to scope. So one of the common mistakes you do in threat modeling is you ignore assets. So how many of you heard of when I think one of the MGM casinos got hacked? Okay, they had pretty good stuff there. They had pretty good security, didn't they? How'd they get hacked? Fish tank. Automatic fish feeder in their fish tanks. Somebody connected? IoT device. Connected their network. They pivoted through that and exploited them through that way. Yeah, the fish tank.
Was it a phishing attack?
That's the worst dad joke I've ever heard. And I've told that story many times, and you're the first one to give me that fishing joke. Ah, man, I can't believe I missed that one. That's awesome. All right. So, yeah, you forget something out there. And whatever you forget, that's what somebody's going to find, okay? Not considering the attack surface. Considering something insignificant. You know, like that 18-year-old firewall that hasn't been patched since 2004, you know? Hey, we're still running, you know, Windows NT4 on our servers. They're fine, you know? Oh, come on. Who doesn't have an NT4 server in their environment still going? So, yeah, I mean, you got that out there. Also, failing to prioritize threats. You know, that's going to be real hard to fix and expensive. Let's make that lower priority. So if you don't really make that kind of stuff happen, that's where you're going to see stuff where it's going to be like, maybe that was more important. And that's where somebody always gets in trouble. Why didn't you make that more important? I don't know, maybe. Also overlooking that human factor. You know, Mildred, the old lady who works, you know, there forever, you know, and she walks around, talks to everybody, makes sure everybody has the coffee, complains about the weather and the corns in her feet. You know, we've all had some of those in our life one time or another. She still types like this. A lot of times, these newfangled computers. I just love downloading. Well, my mom was kind of like a Mildred. You know, she's been dead 6 years. I still have her computer. I would go over and look at this thing. It had so many games of solitaire on there that she would download from the internet. They're free. And I would just put a sniffer on there, and I would watch all this stuff. I'm like, how is this? You know, and then like I opened up her browser, and there's like 8 of those free toolbars. And then this pop-up started flashing at you. You know, I'm like, holy crud. I kept that computer for posterity in my garage. One day I'm going to forensically analyze it for just the grins of it. You know, ancient malware. Well, maybe I'll just give it to Darren over there. Yeah. But I mean, you know, that's going to happen. And then I always see the guys over at where I work at, they're always on their phones playing games. Might be me sometimes, but I at least look at the game, you know, I was like, but yeah, so what you gotta do is you gotta make those threats and kind of overlook that human factor, especially if you have a BYOD environment. Then sometimes you gotta stop focusing on the technical solutions. All right, some of these technical solutions out there are probably not what it takes. Sometimes it just creating that environment of security is really more important out there to get it done, okay? So involving the people factor, getting that buy-in from everybody for all that stuff. All right, and So remember, we have the correct questions we have to ask during threat modeling. Where's my crap? And where is it and what's it labeled? All right, what are my potential threats? What's the likelihood of this threat actually happening? All right, and what's the impact? That's important, impact. What would happen if it did get popped? Okay? Then you look at your entry points and your your weak spots. I only got about 5 minutes left. All right, and all that. So you got to look at where they're going to come in, my ingress points. Got to consider all different attack scenarios. So, who brought in the fish tank feeder into our environment? What about our vendors? Target breach. Do you think they consider their air conditioner vendor who remotely controlled their systems? It wasn't even a SCADA attack. They had it through a different mechanism. But yeah, I worked it with, yeah, this is one of the things I did when I was at Microsoft. I worked with Target on that one. And then you gotta understand your mitigations, your prioritization, effectiveness, okay? So are my mitigations, my countermeasures, are they gonna be effective enough to reduce that threat or to control it? All right, is enough enough? Am I gonna spend $1 million to protect a $10 asset? No. All right, am I gonna buy that $3 million firewall solution to protect, the stuff,
Can I build one with PFC?
Yeah, you build some with PFSense or something. So yeah, and then you have to look at your implementation and your maintenance, patching, all that stuff. That also comes into play with threat modeling. Am I patching quick enough? O-days come out. How soon should I patch? Do I have to wait a full month for the testing cycle, or something prioritized where it needs to be expedited? And then you can have multi-level threat modeling, where you can go out there. It's different from multi-level marketing. We'll talk about that stuff later. No, I'm kidding. Tupperware or something, or Mary Kay, I don't know. You connect it at various levels of abstractation. You can break it down, because sometimes I got to threat model everything. That is way too overwhelming. No, break it down. Threat model one aspect at a time. Break down your networks. Break down your systems. All right, break down your applications. Break down your compliance stuff, We have a threat model where I work where we only focus on items that are for compliance and regulation for that threat modeling, for that type of review. So we break it down for that, because it meets FINRA regs and a lot of other regs like that. All right, and then you have to be able to create a high-level modeling that has that detailed analysis, but you have to also create that summarization of where those vulnerabilities are that you can present to anyone who might be interested as a player for that. And then from that, you get that comprehensive view of your security posture. And that'll either keep you up at night or help you rest easy at night, knowing what you're vulnerable for. I know what I'm vulnerable at. I've done what I can sleep at night. All right, so you have different threat. Here's something you can take photos of. But you have your threat mitigation catalogs. NIST SP800, your cybersecurity framework, has a great section on there where it talks about security and privacy controls out there. You have ISO 27001. I have yet to ever find anyone who's actually read that. I'm not going to spend 498 Swiss francs to buy a copy of that. But everyone always quotes it, don't they? Huh? How many of you always heard somebody quote ISO 27001? Yeah, ask them if they actually read it.
Usually they're using,
I just refer to it because I know it's there. All right, but another great resource you can use is ANISA, and they have the Threat Landscape Report, and the 2023 one is out. You can go to europa.eu, and they're basically the EU's version of NIST out there, and they have some really good stuff out there. So if you're looking to get into threat modeling, or you want to adopt it and you want to see how it is, you're on a budget, or nobody wants to sponsor you, NIST 800.154. Yes, I have read this, all right? And it has the guidelines for threat modeling out there, okay? So this is a great place to go out there and start. And then we have our common mitigations, access control, authentication authorization, data encryption, firewalls, IDS, training, incident response planning, business continuity, patching, vulnerability assessments, and disaster recovery. With that, I open up the floor to questions. Maybe we'll get answers.
You forgot the old pen test model, Dread.
Huh?
The pre-MITRE one, Dread.
Oh, well, I didn't want to mention Dread because I haven't seen anybody really use Dread in a long time. But it is, I do have it in my blog. If you ever find any of my blogs, I do mention Dread in that.
Did you say that you feed your risk assessments into your threat models?
No, actually, it goes the other way.
So we do CIS controls.
Uh-huh.
So you would do your threat model first and then feed that data into your.
Yeah, because if you don't know what your threats are, how can you create a risk?
Right.
So threat modeling becomes before you do your risk assessment, because that feeds into say, okay, here are my vulnerabilities and what my threats are to those vulnerabilities. From that, you can determine what your risk level is and what kind of countermeasures to reduce that risk structure on that. I would go the opposite, on that. But if you already have predetermined risk assessments, they're very complementary in that aspect.
So then your threat model is really going to be, you could use it enterprise-wide, for example, or you could use it for some kind of focused risk.
Exactly.
And then feed those into your control, your risk control.
Correct.
framework architecture.
Yeah, so a lot of times you're doing risk analysis, you have just a general concept of this. Here, you're actually looking at, am I actually vulnerable to this? So is there actually a risk there? Am I still running, I have all these risks for running Windows 2000 systems, but I don't run any Windows 2000 systems. There's no risk there, but you maybe have risk policy and risk, stuff on that. So you would look to see, since you eliminated that as a threat, would you really need have a risk on that for that? So what we do where I work is we use the threat model to determine if there's a vulnerability or if there's a policy violation in their implementation. From that, we then have them open a risk based on that. And then it goes to risk, and they determine what the severity is of that risk, and they give them the timeline for possible mitigations for that vulnerability or for that violation.
Who's they?
Our risk team, our risk and their business information security officers associated with them.
So they're more aligned with business.
Right. So I work in a financial institution, and we have our own risk agents. We have our own risk organization that comes into play, and they focus on that only.
They're a third party?
No, they are internal. Yeah. Like I said, I work for a very large bank. All right. Yeah.
I have a philosophical question about Stride. Do you have a repudiation threat every time you have a spoofing threat?
I believe that is the case because we identify a lot of our threats that way. They come across as spoofing and repudiation because if they're faking who they're coming from, you also have that deniability of it was me. So if I said, I'm up here and I say, I'm Brad Pitt, all right, and I want you to come see my new movies coming out on Apple TV or whatever, you can obviously tell I don't look anything like Brad Pitt. But I said I am, so I have no repudiation there, and I am spoofing it. So, you can deep fake me doing it. You can put deep fake of me doing Brad Pitt. I could look the part, and that'd still be spoofing it. But there would be no repudiation on that still.
Thank you.
All right, anybody else? I got to stop. I've been told to stop. Thank you.